series, where we try to answer the question of how would historically inspired Asiatic bows shooting Asiatic war arrows fare against historically inspired armors. This episode will be covering Ming arrows versus Chinese Brigandine. Now in part 1, we'll be interviewing the researchers and craftsmen who helped make this possible, including the armor supplier, who supplied us the Chinese Brigandine, the antiques researcher, who researched the specifications for the arrowheads that we'll be using for the test, as well as the arrow makers, who helped bring these arrows to life. Part 2, my friend Blake Cole will have the first shot at testing the Ming arrows against the Chinese Brigandine, and in part 3, I'll give it a go. Now worth noting, Blake and I practice a Ming Chinese branch of military archery that was sourced from Gao Ying's 17th century archery treatise. And so you'll see us shooting with thumb ring. That said, hope you enjoy this episode, and let's get started. This is the Brigandine armor panel we'll be using for testing. It consists of a series of steel plates secured to heavy fabric with rivets. One of the benefits of Brigandine armor is the combination of protection and flexibility it provides. Variations of the armor were used throughout Asia, and indeed, the world. The Chinese Brigandine we'll be testing was crafted with historical depictions and accounts in mind. Now, we will compare the relative hardness of the metals used for the arrowhead versus the armor. Then, we will speak with the armor provider. Okay, I'm testing with an HRC 60 pick. Rubbing it lightly over the surface of this arrowhead. A little bit of friction, but it's still sliding. If I try the harder pick, HRC 65, there's more bite. It's kind of sticky. So this arrowhead is probably softer than HRC 65. If I try the HRC 55 pick, it's running over very smoothly, so certainly harder than 55. I would say this is probably closer to HRC 60 in terms of hardness. Now let's do this for the plates for the armor. And if we compare, if I run the HRC 60 pick over the metal, it seems to slide over pretty nicely. I run the HRC 65 pick. There's a little more friction, but it's still, it doesn't bite or stick quite like it does with the arrowhead. So I would say the hardness of this armor is between HRC 60, 65, it might even be a bit above that. As I'm running this across, it's not really biting, whereas the same amount of pressure, I apply this to the head of the arrow, and it kind of sticks. So I would say that this arrowhead, if anything, is slightly softer than the armor.
All right, so thank you for joining us, Caesar. Why don't we start with you just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about how you got into the business of supplying armor, and how your interests formed.
Thank you. So my name is Caesar Zhang. I basically started as an archer, traditional Chinese archer. I shoot with the thumb draw. That's about 10 years ago. And then about 7 years ago, I grew some interest in traditional Chinese armor because back then there was basically nothing in the market. Nothing. The study of Chinese armor was very limited back then.
Now, is the kind of overall aesthetic and design, how is that influenced by kind of historical depictions?
We try to go as historical as possible.
First, we thought we'd bring up a scroll painting titled "Pacifying the Rebels' Victory."
Yeah, my understanding is that this painting came from the later part of the Ming Dynasty when Brigandine armor was more popular. And this is just a depiction of the soldiers wearing Brigandine, performing various military maneuvers. Either here you see, some are archers, one's holding a musket at the very top. Others have melee weapons, a squadron on horseback, some engaging with archery from horseback as well against their opponents. Then more depictions of archery with soldiers wearing Brigandine.
So if you want to touch on any of those points, feel free.
Yeah, certainly. Many of these opinions did not come from me, but from a friend. He, by the name of Hao Jin. He's another admin of the Chinese armor group. I talked to him, and he did an excellent study of the whole subject, the Ming Dynasty armor and the origin of Brigandine. So basically, according to his study, first let's talk about the Ming Dynasty. According to his study, the Brigandine in historical records first came out in early 1420s. It's quite early. And they were mentioning a blue armor. And later the blue armor were referring to the armor made with blue clothes and with plates behind. So that's the 1420s. And the earliest finding that we know so far about the Ming Dynasty Brigandine armor was actually a very interesting one. It was found in General Muang's tomb in Nanjing. And it is basically a mixture of Brigandine and scale armor. Some part of the armor has a Brigandine riveted, has the place riveted behind a textile, behind a fabric, and especially on the face, on the helmet, and the body was made of scale armor, which is kind of the plate is like Brigandine, but it was laced together, probably on a backing. So that's a transitional Brigandine armor.
So I thought we'd transition a little just to give some context for where the panel you provided would have provided coverage here. So it would have been this thigh and potentially knee area, depending on the height of the wearer, I believe.
Yeah, and theoretically, it should cover the knee of the wearer. Recent finding shows that, especially these armor in the picture, they were made in the 18th century. They were ceremonial armor, but they came in different sizes to fit the person.
Now, I thought the fabric on the panel you provided was particularly striking. Is there any significance to this pattern or color here?
When we make this, we were trying to mimic the late Qing Dynasty ceremonial armors color. They were like a bright yellow color. Yeah. And also, I have to add to that, this kind of Y-shaped pattern in the Qing Dynasty, in early Qing Dynasty, they were waved by hand, and it was very expensive. So it was only reserved to the princely rank.
Now, when it comes to just kind of the mechanical aspect of Brigandine, what are kind of the benefits and or disadvantages of kind of the uniqueness of the interlocking plates?
Yeah, firstly, I think the most important part is from our practice, our experiments. It's also based on the historical sources. Brigandine is much lighter than the laminar, and because the size of the plate is bigger, it has more. It has better defense against the concussion. But the disadvantage is that I said, because the plates were not laced together, there may be gaps, in certain angle, so that the arrow can easily goes in.
Now that we've had a chance to learn about the armor, let's learn more about the process that we used to recreate the Ming arrows that we'll be using for the test.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, Peter and John.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
The main reason we wanted to invite you guys here is to kind of share your experience as collaborators on the arrows specifically. So I figured we could just start with general introductions. You guys could just tell us a little bit about yourselves.
I'm Peter Dekker. I'm a dealer in antique arms from mainly Asia. And I got in this trade actually as first a collector, then a researcher. And then I wanted to spend all my time actually doing this collecting and researching. And the only way I could see me doing that was buying and selling items. So that's what I'm doing as a full-time job now. But still, my heart is at research. So whenever there's some opportunity, or like now in the weekends, I'm researching my stuff again.
John?
Yeah, my name's John Lamb. I've been making arrowheads for about 6.5 years now. I've made mostly European arrowheads, socketed arrowheads. Yes, I do make tanged arrowheads as well, as in this case. And yeah, I've literally made a lot of arrowheads in the past, quite a lot. Yeah, I enjoy making them. It's not my full-time job, but it's part of what I do.
So what was kind of your first impression when we approached you about making Asiatic arrowheads?
Well, the first thing was that they should have been tanged. I mean, I've made them before. The difference between what I found was the difference between European tanged arrowheads and Asian is the Asiatic ones have a lot longer tang.
And now for people who don't know, do you just want to briefly explain what a tang is and how it differs from like a
sure.
head, for instance?
Yeah, the tang is, well, it's the difference. A socket is exactly that, where the arrow shaft fits inside the socket. And a tang is where you forge the back side of the arrowhead down and form a shoulder, and then you reduce down to a very thin taper, and that taper goes inside the arrowhead instead of the arrow going inside a socket. The arrowhead goes inside the shaft of the arrow. That's the difference. That's what a tang is on an arrowhead, anyway.
Yeah, it seems almost everywhere in Asia, the Middle East, they would use tang as the default. Sockets are seen, but very rarely. I would say less than 1% of the arrows that were made in these regions. Yeah. So Europe is in a way a little bit of the odd one out, so to say. Even the Vikings would use tanged arrowheads.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Viking ones were a lot shorter tangs as well. I didn't quite, I think they're around about between 2 inches, I think, 2 to 3 inch. And the Asiatic ones are really long.
Yeah. Could it be because most of these heads we find are quite old, so they may have lost part of it?
Yeah, some of them, yeah. I've handled some original ones well, I can't really mention where I went, but I've been in an archives and handled originals. Some of them look to have corroded away, and some of them look as if they were made yesterday.
Great. So I figured, Peter, we'd start with you. We could talk a little bit about the research process we went through and the sketching process. And figure we could start with some initial points of reference from illustrations depicted in Ming manuals. So including the Book of Archery, the Meaning of Archery New Book, and the Guide to Military Preparedness. So I'm going to share a couple of slides now, and just feel free to chime in and talk us through what you see.
Yeah, I think for us, we wanted to draw inspiration from the historical Ming period because we practice a genre of Ming military archery ourselves. So we thought it would be nice to have something that was a little closer to what Ming archers would be using at the time.
Yeah, these illustrations are always quite cartoonish when you compare them to antiques. So it's hard to replicate an arrow from one of these because usually the proportions are quite off. But luckily I've been living in Beijing for a while as a student, and a lot of farmers from around Beijing would find arrowheads in the ground, and they would come and bring them to the city in weekends to sell them for sometimes a pack of cigarettes or other things or just a little bit of money. So it was a great way for them to make some extra with stuff they found in the field anyway. So I built up a collection of I think about 130 arrowheads.
And these are from your personal collection, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, as is it the fourth one down in the picture? I'd say that's probably something that would pierce armor. If any of them have got a chance of piercing armor, that's the one.
And here we have another selection of kind of vast array of heads here, and I've just highlighted some chisel types up in the upper right-hand corner here.
The Chinese have been fighting the Jurchens a lot, and there's one account where one of them actually hit the jaw of general, I think, and they had to chisel away much of the bone to get the arrowhead out. So it was really, it got lodged into the bone.
Have you seen this similar shape, John, before?
I've made chisel heads before, European socketed ones, but they're quite different. Those are the first times I've ever made those. I've never handled a head that looks like that either.
And here one more time is a kind of selection of the antique versions of that heads we tried to emulate here. So from here, Peter, why don't you kind of walk us through the recreation of these heads? And these are, of course, the sketches that eventually were sent to John to base the fabrication off of. Yeah,
so this is a drawing of what I think one of my antiques would have looked like when new. And to make the drawing, I had to take into account that metal actually expands when it corrodes, and it can expand to astonishingly about 10 times as thick as it used to be. Another thing I changed was the tang length, because as you can see, tangs on these tend to be quite short. I thought in an armor piercing test, if you want to test the head performance against the plate, it's also good to have a little bit of a long tang, all within historical proportions.
Yeah, well, if you get I should imagine if you get an off-center hit and the arrow's not quite straight when it hits, the shorter the tang, it's going to force, like it's going to cantilever out of the arrow shaft. It could break the arrow shaft and the arrowhead could come completely out. So the longer the tang, the less likely that's going to happen. I've worked to sketches before. But you have to remember, well, yeah, I'm using a hammer. You don't get millimeter perfect every time. I've worked to sketches that I've done that I've got from museum archives that I've been in when I've weighed and measured, and I've scaled arrowheads. Those were European arrowheads. Forging these, yeah, the tricky bit about forging this type of arrowhead is forging the tang, getting the shoulder. It's not too difficult, but that's the hardest bit. Yeah, I remember that well. That's really hot, that. You have plenty to drink. Yeah, that's I've got a coal forge and I sometimes use gas. That one's my gas forge. Yeah, that's the process I used because it's, well, to be honest with you, it's more convenient to use gas. I can switch it on and get it up to temperature quite quickly. Yeah, that does get very hot. That one, that is a big burner in that gas forge. I can get up to welding heat in that. That's the rough forging of a tang. It's not quite finished. What I do after that step in the process is I'd take it and I'd hot file it to tidy up the shoulder.
As you want to tell us a little bit about the material you used?
Yeah, sure. I used basically it's a basic steel. It's called EN9. It is 0.5% carbon, which means it is hardenable, but it's not silly hard. It's not like a tool steel. It's as we've discussed about steel. Yeah, I've used mid carbon, not high carbon, mid carbon, which was it hardens quite well.
You want to tell us just very briefly about the kind of hardening process and what that means?
Yeah, sure. When you're hardening steel, you're heat treating it. Basically, with the N9, you get it up to critical temperature, which I test with. When it gets to critical temperature, it's non-magnetic. When the magnet doesn't stick, EN9 you quench in oil. So I quenched those in oil, and the rapid cooling traps the carbon, makes it hard. It will form. It's basically a martensite. It'll form harder steel. It'll just go harder. It'll change its structure. But actually, before I harden, before I quench, sorry, I'll thermal cycle, and I'll heat it up, heat the steel up to critical, and then I'll allow it to cool slowly and shrink it. That shrinks the grain of the steel and makes it stronger.
Yeah, I think it's probably pretty much spot on, because especially in the earlier periods, the steel used for these arrowheads was usually also a lower carbon. Sometimes they would have inserted edges just like a sword with very high carbon, but those were only the highest quality heads. So the majority of the army wouldn't have access to them. In the Qing, there's this war where they sent, I think, 480,000 military arrows to the war zone, and only 20,000 special arrows for the bannermen that probably were forged like that. So very expensive as well. So I think in the Ming, that would also probably be similar. And some cultures, maybe like the nomadic cultures, may have had even more trouble getting enough steel than sedentary people. So I expect most of their arrowheads to be low carbon iron. And a lot of arrowheads we tested were actually not as hard as steel can be. So probably indicative of more of a lower carbon content as well. But also a lot of the plates would have similar issues, probably mostly iron as well. So probably the heads and the plates would be fairly similar in content.
All right, and here we can see the finished product. Very impressive. And we then sent the heads over to John Potter, a master fletcher, who is your friend, I believe, John.
Yep.
Anything either of you would like to say about that process, feel free.
Yeah, there's not a single arrow that we know of that can be accurately dated to the Ming. Quite a difference with the Qing, where we have hundreds. But this would be a fairly typical construction. So you would have the tang inserted into wood and then wrapped, traditionally with sinew, but it could be any strong fiber. One of the main important things with a fitting like this is that where the tang ends in the arrow, that there's no open space, because then you basically have an arrow that's solid and then becomes a tube and then becomes tanged. The tang construction, of course, is very strong, and it will create a weak spot right behind the head. So that was one of the main concerns of these arrow makers, to fill that little spot. What I often would do is to heat it, so it would dig into the arrow and make a cavity especially for it. Very nice to see these arrows fly once more after some century of absence or more. To be honest, I don't really know what's gonna happen. It depends on so many factors, because a lot of the Asian armor was that individual plates were not as high quality as European armor, but it's a system that works together. So you have the plates that actually move, and it's a bit like shooting an arrow into a curtain. It's the shockwave that goes through the curtain that actually slows down the arrow. The hardness difference between the arrowhead and the armor may or may not have consequences. That's also something hard to predict. One thing that's important is that the arrowhead can at least bite into the armor a little bit, so that the head stays in exactly the same spot for the entirety of its energy transfer. So when the shockwave moves from head to nock, basically. And that is more easily done when the plate is softer than the head, but it doesn't mean it can't happen.
Predictions, I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I think armor probably works, otherwise they wouldn't have worn it, to be fair. Has anybody thought about concussive force? if the armor can move when it's hit, what are the forces behind the armor? Would that hurt the individual wearing it, whether it penetrated the armor or not? That's something that's interested me over, well, always. It's always interested me.
Well, I think I think they may have a hard time go through the plates directly, but they would certainly have a chance to shooting at a certain angle, and especially due to the structure of the Brigandine. You know, if you can rip off the rivet, it can go in. Because the Brigandine is overlapped a little bit, so at a certain angle, if it goes through the fabric, and it may go in.
Hi, I'm Blake Cole, and welcome to my portion of episode 2 of our Warfare Research Series. So today I'll be using a Tehran by MR Bows. These first few segments will revolve around measurements, so let's get started with the bow's poundage. I'll be using this draw table to determine the poundage of my bow. Now I have here one of the war arrows I'll be using in the test. This will help me measure out my full draw. The wrap you see at the front of the arrow is a tactile indicator called a bow hand anchor. Now when that touches my bow hand, I'll know I'm at full draw. As you can see, the valley of the knock is now in line with my full draw of 34 inches. So what we'll do is we'll swap in the bow and draw to that same distance. I'll now zero out the scale and measure our poundage. £110 at 34 inches. Now that I've established the draw weight of my bow, we'll move on to a critically important calculation for the test, which is the kinetic energy of each arrow we'll be shooting at the armor. Now, in order to determine the kinetic energy, which is defined as the energy of an object due to its motion, we'll need two numbers. First, the mass of each arrow. We have an arrow scale for that. And second, the velocity of each arrow. We have a chronograph for that. So, very much looking forward to trying these out. And let's go get the armor set up. Here we have our armor panel spread across a cylinder-shaped hard foam target. And now this would have laid across the thigh of the person wearing the armor. So right now we're trying to emulate that here. All right, so we'll be shooting from 20 yards this time. So I have my rangefinder here. And we also have the tape marked over here at 60 feet, which of course equals 20 yards. All right, so we've arrived at my portion of the shooting phase. So we're going to start with the leaf-shaped arrow, and then move on to the diamond-shaped arrow, and finally end with the chisel-shaped arrow. So, let's see what kind of result we get. All right, so we have our first hit of the day, and this is with the leaf-shaped arrowhead. So it looks like we did get some penetration, and it stayed in on the hit. So now let's look a little closer behind the material. And we have ourselves full plate penetration here with the leaf-shaped arrow. So it went in about all the way up to the shaft. The full length of the arrowhead made it through. All right, so you can see it's clear through there. The back of the plate, so it cracked it. And as far as the damage to the arrow, it's fairly minimal. The tip is blunted, but other than that, it survived pretty well. Let's wiggle it a little, try and take it out of the foam at least. So, landed just at the top of the plate actually there, so it kind of split it there. Yeah, so there's the plate with the arrow out. Little crack in the one above. And again, looks like our arrow did pretty well here. Blunted tip again. But it's looking pretty good. Now I did notice when I pulled it out, it's going to be hard to show with the camera, but there was some bend in the shaft. We have our chisel down here, which was deflected. And we reviewed in slow motion, saw that this was the hit here. So it pierced the material. And it did put a little crack in the plate. I wanted to see what happened if we could hit it a little more squarely. So let's take a look behind the curtain here. You come around here. And we do have clear penetration of this plate here. I'll go ahead and pull it out. And we'll look at the damage. If I can pull it out. Alright, so we have a pretty serious extraction problem here. I've been wiggling this, lightly hammering it. I don't think we're going to be able to get it out. It cracked here a little bit, just trying to manipulate it, so I think I'm going to have to use the smallest needle nose pliers I have just to bend that flap up a little to get it out. This would have been quite the problem to have if you got hit by this, and you can see how strong this is. I can hardly even bend it. There we have it. So I would not want to have that in my armor or my leg. Okay, so I'm back in the lab for a little debrief now that I've finished my shots. First, let's assess the arrows. So the most obvious damage is to the chisel, which is now bent. There doesn't appear to be any damage to the shaft, so I assume the tang is still in place and that the bend is at the base of the arrowhead itself. Now the diamond and the leaf were both blunted on impact. But overall, the durability of the arrowheads and the arrows was very impressive, and I think it speaks to the craftsmanship. Okay, so let's have a look at the armor itself. Now I've marked with tape any damage, so Justin has that as a reference. We'll work backwards, starting with the chisel shots. Okay, so first let's talk about that great deflection on the first chisel shot. Now, upon closer inspection, it appears that the most likely explanation for the deflection was that it hit a spot where there was actually plate overlap. So you can see here it pierced and left this chip in the first plate it hit, then a small dent in the plate behind it. So this points to one of the strengths of the armor, which is that the spots in which the plates overlap are particularly strong, and it accomplishes this while maintaining its flexibility. Now in terms of our test, it also shows that even with the tremendous kinetic energy we're generating, our arrows are not screeching through these plates, or the damage to the plate underneath would have been much more significant. As it stands, it's barely damaged. Now with this second chisel shot, we wanted to see the result of a hit square on the plate. Now, a quick note about this second chisel shot, it was a separate session, and due to the moisture, the arrow had taken on about 10 grains, but this would have had a negligible impact on kinetic energy. We're talking a couple joules at most. Now, as you can see, extraction without tools was basically impossible for me. So, what happens when you're struck with this in one of these plates during the heat of battle? The shafts on these war arrows are very thick. It would be very hard to snap it off. So, this would be quite an impediment during warfare, and not a task I'd want to be taking on when people are trying to kill me. One additional consideration with a bow this heavy: even with the deflection, the sheer force of impact could cause damage to the tissue or bone, and this could be debilitating during combat. Alright, so similar to the first chisel shot, the diamond also hit an area with a bit of plate overlap. But it was able to pass through, and as you can see, even put a little slice in the plate behind. Now, I think this points to one of the strengths of the diamond. It seems to incur the least amount of resistance when piercing the plates. I think that's likely due to its slender shape and sharp angles. It doesn't get a lot of drag when it hits. So as you can see, the leaf hit was particularly devastating here to the plate. It really blew it wide open. And I think a lot of that is due to just the sheer size of the arrowhead itself. However, the foam did escape damage, and I think this points to one of the strengths of the armor, which is that it isn't necessarily hugging your body, and depending on how it was laying across the leg, for instance, these plates, even if punctured, have the ability to catch the arrows in a way that could prevent damage to the flesh, as long as it wasn't a dead-on hit. So this concludes my portion of the episode. I had an absolute blast. I just want to thank all of our Patreon members, everyone we collaborated with, everyone who contributed to the video. And now to get this armor off to Justin, and I can't wait to see his shots. Thank you so much for watching.
Green bow, that's right. So I draw this arrow 28 1/4 from the knock groove to the back of the handle. Yeah. Now the actual arrow measures 28 7/8 to the back of the bow hand anchor. But because I leave a little bit of a margin, I'm actually only drawing 28 1/4. Yep. Yeah, make sure you move back. Okay, 113 pounds. All right, get back. Hey. Here's the weight for the diamond-shaped head. And we have 1,300 grains. Okay. 177 feet per second. The heaviest arrow being tested is the leaf head. That has a mass of 1,393 grains. (169 feet per second). The lightest arrow being tested is the chisel, and that has a mass of 1,277 grains. (177 feet per second). All right, today we're at Ohlone Archery in San Leandro, California, in the Bay Area. So we'll be shooting the Brigandine armor from 20 yards. All right, let's see what we have here. So at least the head has gone in. Looks like it's gone through a plate. Let's take a closer look. As you can see, this much of the head has made it through the plate. The plate itself is kind of split. Here's the damage from the front side. And here's the damage from the rear side. All right, looks like we've got a hit. And the arrow itself kind of broke. Probably take it to this side. All right, what do we have here? Seems like quite a bit more penetration this time. Let's take a look here. Okay. Looks like it hit through one of the corners of the plates. Yeah, just kind of, as you can see, I split the corner of this plate and probably deflected off this one to go further into the target right here, into the cloth. This arrow's done. What am I supposed to do with this? Oh, here we go. So here's a close-up of the damage from this side, and then a close-up of the damage from here. So it kind of split the corner of that plate off. Okay, let's see what happened here. GoPro, stop recording. Okay, let's see. Did this actually hit a plate? Let's find out. So we've gotten through, let's do this closer here. Underneath looks like, oh wow, okay. So it looks like it hit the bottom half of the previous plate. Let's see if we can pull this out. You can see how far it went in. Oh, actually, no, it's a different plate. My bad. So, yeah, we've got this much depth of penetration. And it ended up just sort of shattering this plate right here. There we go. Okay, here's the damage from the front. And then if we look back, we see that this plate has been, you know, the hole's here, but the split is much bigger here. Okay, let's review the damage that the arrowheads themselves experienced. This first one is the diamond head. You can see that there is scarring on the edges, quite a bit of scarring. This is the arrowhead that's the smallest. It also penetrated the least in my case. And I don't remember whether this scarring occurred after the penetration or upon the extraction, but this suggests that the steel in the armor is in fact harder than the steel used for the arrowheads. Here's the damage for the leaf. The general shape is pretty much intact, although it's worth noting that the very tip here has been blunted. You know, it used to be a little more pointy. And then finally, we have the chisel. General shape held up. There's a little bit of scarring on the front tip, but that doesn't seem to be an issue here. And again, the leaf and the chisel penetrated deeper compared to the diamond. So we learned a lot of interesting things in the filming of this episode, and a couple of the things that stand out, to me at least, are that the tang in these arrows was pretty important for maintaining durability. In the first episode, we had arrows that would break on impact, especially head popping off, breaking between the head and the shaft. And when that happens, all that effort that the archer spent shooting the arrow kind of goes to waste. So keeping the arrow intact and together, that's really important, and hats off to the craftsman for making this possible. The other important lesson was that the geometry of the arrowhead matters a lot. These arrows were softer. The steel used in these arrowheads is actually softer than the steel used in the Brigandine, but they managed to penetrate because of their special shapes here. So, when you're going to war, you have to choose your arrowhead wisely for the application at hand. Tests like what we performed in this episode give us data points, but as with any research, answering some questions often leads to new questions. So, again, these arrowheads were softer than the steel that we were shooting at, but we were shooting them with kinetic energies of 120 to 140 plus joules. So, open questions would include, well, what would happen if we used a softer grade of armor? Right? Would it be more pliable? Would it be able to sort of bend and deflect the force of the arrow a little better? What would happen if we used a softer grade of steel for the heads? Right? Would they be able to do the same kind of damage? What if we had arrows traveling with kinetic energies of, say, 110 joules, 100 joules, right? Could we establish a tighter upper bound on the protection that this Brigandine armor could provide? We hope to explore these and other questions in future research. In the meantime, we had a lot of fun filming this. We hope you had fun watching this as well. We'd like to thank the following researchers, craftsmen, and suppliers for providing us the equipment for this test, as well as conveying special thanks to the following people. We'd like to thank our Patreon patrons, including Joseph Beeson, Paul Zimyanis, and everyone else who helped make this possible. And for those who are interested in supporting our future projects, here is the link below.